this week we're doing the detailed analysis. If you remember, early in the semester, I wrote my way of understanding this was what's happening in the world, what's happening in the text, and what's happening in your heart. Anybody remember this? When we are finishing up this week, the observations about the passage itself, we're finishing these two on the top, right? So if you look at our little bridge here, all of this is observations about the text. So what's happening in the world is your historical analysis, right? Who's writing it? What's the context? Who are they writing it to? What's going on with that temple of Diana in Ephesus? All this sort of stuff is happening here. In the text is more of the literary analysis and the detailed analysis. What are the words that's being used? How does this fit into the structure? And how does all of this organize into Paul's argument? Moving forward, so this is what we're finishing this week. By the end of this week, when you submit your detailed analysis, all of your observations about the text are going to be done. To the point where at the end of this section of your paper, you should be able to very clearly say, when Paul wrote this to the Ephesians, this is what he meant, right? So the idea of what did Paul originally mean? Or what did he originally intend his audience to hear when he said this? Good? That's what we're doing here. When we move forward with sections 5 and 6, or what's happening in your heart, then we need to translate it to, okay, we've established this historical fact that we are positioning. Paul said this. Paul meant for his audience to hear this. That's an aspect of history, right? We're reading a text, just like we would be reading Shakespeare, right? The stuff that we've done so far, we could do with Shakespeare. To say Shakespeare wrote these things, what's the historical context, the glass of water, or whatever it is with Shakespeare. What do these metaphors mean in the context of 17th century England? So when Shakespeare wrote this, what did he intend the audience to hear? That's a historical question, and that is all that we've been doing so far. Next week, we'll move into, all right, but so what? Right? So we've established this historical idea that Paul is saying this, but what does that have to do with us? And that's when we get into the synthesizing ideas of, see if I can get back to it. What is the meaning of the text? Not just what is he saying, but what does it mean theologically? And what does that have to do with us? How do we apply that to our lives, or how do we change based on what we're hearing? These are not historical questions. Does that make sense? So if you're talking with a random non-Christian, somebody that you know down the street or whatever else, thank you. Thanks. All of this you can agree on. Right? When Paul took pen to paper, this is what he meant. This is what he intended his audience to hear. This is where you would disagree, right? When you say, well, when Paul said this, I think he's talking about this theological aspect. I think that he's making an argument about the existence of God, or whatever it is. And then that's going to shape, the theological argument that he's making is going to shape how I live my life. Those are positions that you won't agree with for somebody who's not a Christian. You see the difference in doing the historical aspect and the theological aspect, right? So all that to say, we're finishing with the historical aspect this week, with identifying this ancient figure wrote something and meant something. What did he mean, right? And so we're still using the same example from Ephesians that we've been using. Understanding what the author wanted to say to the audience. That's the main point of what we're trying to get at. And so this is our example. Paul praising God because of our riches that we have in Christ. He writes how these riches involve our adoption from the Father according to his plan and purposes, and by the person and work of Jesus. Now, when we get into today, our detailed analysis, some of this I feel like is going to seem the same as the formal analysis. So when we started the formal analysis, here it is, we talked about genre, right? The literary form that you're looking at, comparing poetry to letters to narratives to apocalyptic text, right? But it's the same idea that we're going to start with today, looking at the genre for the detailed analysis. Now, when you go through and do your reading for this week, Gorman is going to, I think, helpfully separate what belongs rightly in the formal analysis versus what belongs in the detailed analysis, right? So the formal analysis has more to do with the overarching meaning of the passage, where it fits in the context literarily, how the author is using rhetoric to get that done. The detailed analysis is going to dive more into the specific words that he's using, right? Paul is using this word glory. And what does that word mean? So this is where you kind of see, you could have a paragraph that's a word study on a specific word that Paul is using that would fit into this detailed section. But before we get to that, we have to kind of understand what it is that we're talking about. Because I think the example in one of the videos that's on MyFire talks about, if you go into a library or to a bookstore and you don't understand what section you're in, if you pick up a book and read it, it might not make sense if you're expecting a different type of book, right? A resource book is going to be different than a cooking book, which is going to be different than sci-fi. And if you pick up a cooking book and think that it's sci-fi, you're not going to understand it. It's not going to make sense, right? So there are all these different categories of genre. In the New Testament in particular, we've got Gospels and history, letters, and apocalyptic literature. There's a whole big debate, which doesn't have anything to do with our class, but I like it, about Gospels as a genre, right? So the way that the four Gospels are written make them distinct from narratives. They're not just pure history. There's some sort of like theological history that's focused on the person of Jesus. And so the genre here is just called gospel because it's something different than a narrative. It's something different than just like a chronological historical story, right? But history is in here. What's the history book that's in the New Testament?
Acts.
Yeah. Some people would, I think I would actually classify Acts. I wouldn't say it's history. I would put it in the same category as gospel and say that the book of Luke is a bio. It's an ancient biography of Jesus. And that the book of Acts is an ancient biography of the church, of the Holy Spirit, right? The things that Jesus continued to do is how Luke describes it. So I wouldn't even say that Acts is pure history, because I think Acts still has a theological point that it's making that separates it from, say, 1 Samuel or 2 Kings. Those are history books, right? Letters, obviously, are what we're talking about. And letters make up like half of the New Testament, right? In terms of number of verses. What's the first letter in the New Testament? Romans. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. And then what's the last letter in the New Testament? Jude. And even there's a big distinction between the letters. Romans is super different than 2nd John, just in terms of the genre, the type of writing that it is. And so you get into this idea of subgenres. Apocalyptic, I think we all know it's Revelation. So we get into these subgenres. So you can look at, in the Gospels, there's parables and riddles and sermons and stuff like that. We also have this category for the letters of formal or informal, right? If they're for special occasions or if they're general epistles. If they're, I don't want to say general epistles. If they're for special occasions or if they are written generally for a broad audience, not addressing specific concerns. Here's a little breakdown, which is interesting because, oh no, it doesn't. Somewhere else in here it put, Oh yeah, it's the next one. It put Revelation as, it listed it as apocalyptic, but it's under the heading of letters. Paul's letters, general letters, which are non-Pauline letters, and then it put Revelation in there as a letter, which I thought was interesting.
Wasn't it had letters to the church?
Yeah, and it kind of says that it's supposed to be a letter, but it's definitely not, right? I mean, it's definitely apocalyptic. It's definitely, it reads the same as whatever the apocalyptic ones are in the Old Testament, Daniel and portions of Ezekiel and whatever else, where it reads very apocalyptic. It reads much less as a letter than anything else on this list, right? Everything else on this list has an introduction, this is who I am and who I'm writing to, the body of the argument, and then some sort of conclusion. I'm writing this with my own hand and I'm sending it by so-and-so's name. Revelation doesn't really give us that, but maybe that's beside the point. So when we're looking at letters, the letters that we see in the New Testament are similar to other ancient correspondences. You have informal letters where somebody is writing to somebody else, and it's only really meant to be read by that person. So I think like 2nd and 3rd John would probably fall into this, where it didn't seem like it was intended to be read widely. Whereas you have formal letters that are written, even if I'm writing a letter to you specifically, I'm intending for it to be read publicly. So you can think of, we talked about Hamilton last week or the week before, when Hamilton and Sam Seabury are arguing, they're writing letters to each other, but they are supposed to be public letters that are read by everybody, and it's just that person is the audience. That person is the intended target, right? In those sorts of circumstances, so when Hamilton is arguing with Seabury, the purpose is not to convince Seabury that Hamilton is right. That's not what Hamilton is writing. Hamilton is writing to convince everybody else that's watching. So he's arguing with somebody, never intending that person will agree with him, right? And I think that it's part of the aspect of these formal letters, is recognizing that they have very much a public presentation to them. Now, I think this is fun. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about today reminds me of the way that the New Testament was actually spread and gathered. And I don't think we've talked about this very much, but the way that the actual Bible came into existence. So, when Paul is writing, he is by definition not where he is sending the letter to, right? If he's writing to the Romans, he's not in Rome, right? If he's writing to Corinthians, he's outside of Corinth. Even though he's been to Corinth before, he's not there. Ephesians and Colossians or wherever else. He's writing somewhere that he is not currently present. And so he is sending this letter as a substitute, as some sort of authority representing himself. Now, in ancient times, there are ways to validate that the letter you received is actually from who you think it's from. Right? Can anybody think of examples of how you could prove? Right? If you showed up, if I wasn't here on Thursday and you showed up and you said, "Oh, I've got this letter from Dr. Langley that says you all get 100 in the class," how could you verify that I wrote the letter?
Signature.
It would have to have a signature. It would have to have something of mine that would prove to everybody that you didn't make it up, right? Not accusing you of making it up. So, in order to prove the authority of the letter, you have to have stuff that would validate that it is Paul that's saying it. And that becomes difficult because Paul uses, it's this fancy Greek word, hermeneutics. I don't know if that M is supposed to be there. He uses letter writers. And depending on the relationship that Paul has with the person, there's differing levels of freedom that the person has in expressing Paul's ideas. So the way that I would think of it is, if I were writing a letter and I got my wife to write the letter that I was dictating, she knows me well enough to adjust the things that I'm saying verbally to make them fit into the writing, right? But if I asked Caleb to write the letter and I was sitting down and dictating it and he was writing it, I don't think he knows me well enough to feel comfortable changing the things that I'm saying. Does that make sense? So depending on the relationship that Paul has with this person, the way that they're reflecting Paul's ideas can change. So we know that for Romans, and I think for Ephesians as well, right? This guy is named Tertius. I think some of you wrote about that in your papers, that this guy is named in the same way that it's named in Romans. Paul has a relationship with this person. So this person might feel some freedom to adjust or to add some style or some rhetoric to the things that Paul is dictating. When Paul is in prison, I don't think he has access to this guy. And so sometimes when Paul is in prison, he has to hire somebody and pay them to write down what he's saying. And when he does that, I don't think the paid scribe has the level of relationship needed to change the way that Paul is talking. Does that make sense? I think he just writes verbatim what Paul says. So this is kind of a roundabout point, but this is where, when we talk about Deutero-Paul, Second Paul, the non-Pauline letters. So we talked about how there's 13 letters attributed to Paul. 7 of them are confirmed, and 6 of them are suspect. There's an argument within scholarly circles that this is why. That the 6 ones that are suspect are written by somebody else. But not that they weren't dictated by Paul. Paul dictated them and somebody wrote them and didn't have the same relationship with Paul that the first guy did, right? So whether it's Tertius, who is no longer accessible, and so Paul has to hire somebody and they're writing word for word what Paul is saying, or vice versa, whatever it is, that is how you can understand the differences in style between the letters or the theological developments. It's because this person has changed, right? It's still Paul, the same apostle is writing all 13 letters. He's still dictating the letters, but the person recording them has changed. Does that make sense? At the end of some of the letters, what does Paul famously write at the end of some of his letters?
Doesn't he say, this is Paul, I'm writing this in my own hand?
Yeah. So he says, I, Paul, wrote this with my own hand. Why is that important?
To identify his handwriting and confirm that it's him.
Is there anything distinctive about Paul's handwriting? Does anybody know?
I don't know for sure, but I assume it's probably not as good as
There's probably that. Were you going to say something?
Let's see that thing.
I don't think so. So, in one of the letters, Philippians, I'm not sure where it is, Paul describes how much the church that he's writing to loved him. And he says, you would have gouged out your own eyes for me, right? So based on that and based on other passages where Paul is talking about the thorn in his side, the physical ailments that he's facing, as he aged, there's speculation that I think most scholars agree with, that Paul was going blind. And so his writing is big, huge, scrawling writing, right? Because he can't see anymore. He can see, but he can't see well. And so when he says, I, Paul, write this in my own hand, it's huge, right? And so people would see that and they, oh yeah, that's Paul's handwriting right there, right? Because it was distinctive. We have this joke. When my wife and I first got married, we had to write thank you cards for all of our wedding gifts. And my wife is big on thank you cards, and she's very good about it and very quick, and I'm not. And so we got to the point where I still needed to write cards for my friends that got us gifts, but they were really for me. And so I sat down on my bed, and she wrote. So I would dictate, and she wrote what I was saying. And then at the end, I signed it and wrote, I, Stuart, write this in my own hand. Because I have bad handwriting, and so the people who I sent it to would know. But the idea is, this is all the source of authority that we were talking about at the beginning, is when Paul writes this and says, I, Paul, write this with my own hand, there's this source of authority. That he is spiritually present with the audience while they're reading his letter because he can't be there in person. Does all of this jive? All this makes sense? So, when the letters are written, so Paul writes it, Paul dictates it, somebody writes it down, they probably wrap it up and seal it, and then somebody has to take it. Most of the time, it seems like in these letters, there are trusted friends who deliver the letter, and Paul will name them in the letter. So he will write, I am giving this to my homeboy Peter. And then Peter shows up at the church with a letter, and the letter has his name on it as another source of authentication, of authority, right? And these folks are often named. Now, all of this helps to validate Paul's authority and ensure that his authority is respected, right? Sometimes there's co-senders, there's other people who are listed as other writers, right? Timothy or whoever else. Paul will say something like, oh, this person is here with me, with the idea of like, they also agree with me, they're also ascribing their authority to this letter. Now, when the letters are received, they are read aloud. I think we might have talked about this last week, but most of these texts are memorized. Even, the Gospels are memorized and performed in the earliest Christian settings. So the letters, for sure, are memorized and performed. So someone will stand up in front of the Christian gathering and not just recite, but perform the book of Romans. And they would just stand up and say the whole thing. And by perform, I mean they would change voice. They would move positions on the stage in order to emphasize certain points or to give different characters in the story different positions and mannerisms on stage so that the audience is more aware of what's going on. So they're intended to be read aloud. They're intended not just to be read by even the one church in Ephesus, right? Even the letter that says to the church in Ephesus, it's intended to be read aloud and to be read widely. So when the church in Ephesus receives this letter, they accept it and they hear it, but then the letter probably goes somewhere else, and somewhere else hears it and accepts it also. What happens, and this is what I was talking about with the development of the Bible, is that letter circulates, and at some point somebody comes along and says, well, I want to write down the letter. I want to make a copy of it. So the person who's circulating with the letter and performing it will stay at somebody's church. Say they're in Philippi. And so they stay at Philippi, and somebody who lives there writes down everything that the person is saying. So the person will do the same thing and stand up and recite it. And the person will write down word for word the book of Romans, right? Now the person who's already going around and reading it to everybody leaves. But now the person that's in Philippi has a copy of the letter that they've written themselves. So then one or two things happen. They can go somewhere and take the letter with them and give it to somebody else. Or somebody else is visiting and stops in Philippi and says, hey, I've got this book from Ephesians. And so the guy in Philippi who has Romans and the guy who comes in with the book of Ephesians, they spend 6 months together copying each other's letters, right? And so now we've got a third copy of Romans and a second copy of Ephesians that can do the same thing. And these books circulate in that way for a couple hundred years, where the books that are authoritative, the books that are proven to be trustworthy, the books that are proven to be theologically accurate, travel. And somebody will stay and make copies of it, and then they'll go somewhere else, and they'll carry those copies elsewhere, and the people that are in those churches want copies of them. To the point where when you get to Nicaea, which everybody talks about Nicaea, I think we might have talked about it in the beginning, you get to all of these representatives from all of these churches come to Nicaea, and they talk about what books they have. And because of the authority that's been established for hundreds of years, there are certain books that have authority and representation, right? Everybody's got the book of Romans, and nobody's got the book of Thomas. And so that is how the authority is established. And the authority that Paul establishes here, what we talked about at the very beginning, I skipped. This authority that he's establishing is the same authority that's used to establish which books belong in canon and which ones don't. Which ones are inspired by the Holy Spirit and which ones aren't, right? So the stuff that we're talking about here with this amount of authority that Paul is exerting and writing letters to other people, it's important because that's what helps us understand why we have certain books in the Bible and why we don't have others, right? Because the Gospel of Thomas did not come with any authority. It pretended to be written by someone with authority, but it wasn't sent by a buddy who had the authority. It wasn't signed by Thomas's hand, right? It did not have the same markers as this, and therefore we concluded as a church that it was not inspired by the Holy Spirit. Do you see the connection between Paul writing this letter with authority and us establishing the canon with authority?